Alrighty, well, it's 12 p.m. now, so we might get started. Thank you to everyone for tuning in to today's webinar, The Impacts on Soil Erosion, Cover Cropping and Grazing. I'm Demi Taylor, I'm an Extension Officer at BCG, and I'll be facilitating today. The session's being run as part of BCG's Building Drought Resilience of Vulnerable Soils project, supported by the Mallee Catchment Management Authority. Throughout the project, our work has been largely focused on landscapes in high wind erosion zones in the Vic Mallee, so often areas presenting with a combination of susceptible soils and historically low ground cover. So the overall aim is to support long-term practice change and reduce the future risk in areas most likely impacted by drought. But we'll hear more about that project soon. So now just some housekeeping. I just want to note that we are recording the webinar today. And I also want to encourage everyone to ask any questions that come to mind throughout. We don't have a designated question time at the end of the webinar. So if you have any questions in mind, just use the chat function to write them out, and I'll ensure to ask the presenters at the end of each of their sessions. So jumping into it, our first session is on mitigating soil erosion and building drought resilience of vulnerable soils, presented by Dr. Yolanda Plowman. Yolanda joined BCG as the Senior Research Manager last Feb. She completed her undergraduate studies in biological sciences and mathematics before going on to complete a PhD in soil microbiology associated with wheat roots. Throughout her PhD, Yolanda undertook a number of teaching positions in microbiology, food security and cellular biology subjects at the Uni of Sydney. She's passionate about food security and the future of Australian ag, and is leading BCG's work in building drought resilience of vulnerable soils. So BCG's ground cover project is quite multifaceted and has been an interesting piece of work over the past 18 months. So I'll hand over to Yolanda now to share a bit more of that. Thanks, Yolanda.
Thanks for that introduction, Demi. I don't need to introduce the project now, which is fantastic. Welcome to everybody who's joining us today. So I'll jump right in then. I'll just share my screen, which hopefully works. If it doesn't, please jump in and let me know. Now, okie dokie. So I would like to start by acknowledging our project funder, which is the Mallee Catchment Management Authority, and they funded this project through funds available through the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. The project collaborators are the Mallee CMA, Agriculture Victoria and Mallee Sustainable Farming. So we've got a number of different collaborators all working on the same purpose, which is protecting vulnerable soils and increasing drought resilience. I'll give a quick introduction to the project itself, and then I'll talk through some of the broader context of soil erosion issues in our region. The title of the project is Building Drought Resilience of Vulnerable Soils and Low Rainfall Cropping and Grazing Systems. The objective is to improve drought resilience of low rainfall, high erosion prone landscapes. And we set about doing this by setting up a number of demonstration sites in the low rainfall zone, which tested a mixture of current agronomic strategies geared around protecting soil from wind erosion, whilst maintaining or ideally improving farm productivity. We focused on paddocks in the high to very high wind erosion susceptibility zones. So here we are in Birchip at the Birchip Cropping Group, myself and Ali, not Mark, obviously. Mark's at CSIRO. South of us at BCG, we've got a region called the Wimmera, and this is a typically medium rainfall zone and a heavier soil. To the east of Birchip, we've got the North Central region as well, and similarly to the Wimmera, heavier soils and typically medium rainfall zone. When we go north of Birchip, however, we've got the Mallee, and this is a low rainfall zone, typically a sandier soil and higher susceptibility to erosion. So if we look very quickly at the Wimmera and the North Central regions, what we're looking at here are some graphs, and the data for the graphs uses ground cover or total vegetation cover as an environmental indicator for soil erosion risk. The specific indicator on the graphs is agricultural land protected in percentage, and that's protection from wind erosion. If we take a look at the time series for both regions, so the Wimmera and the North Central, the target agricultural land protected through ground cover percentage is generally high, somewhere between 80 and 100. And generally the actual percent of protected agricultural land is above the target, and it fluctuates in a minor way over the years. However, if we focus on the Victorian Mallee region, which we know as the Mallee, we can see that there's a dramatic peak and trough effect that mirrors the cropping season. The peaks that you can see here, they occur in August, and that's typically when crop biomass is at its highest. And at the troughs, they occur in January and February, indicating that the soil is most vulnerable to wind erosion over the summer when the ground is barest. During this period, farmers are staying on top of weeds in their paddocks to conserve nitrogen and soil moisture for the following season, and this will mean chemical removal of any paddock vegetation. So we know that there's a high risk of soil erosion in the Mallee. Let's refresh ourselves on why that's a problem. Firstly, soil erosion leads to air pollution. So health organisations and communities have concerns about displaced dust particles and the impact on human health. We will all remember stories in the news about dust storms as a direct result from farming in our region. And so it's very front of mind. Secondly, soil erosion also means the removal of valuable topsoil, meaning a loss of soil nutrients. Soil nutrition is a critical element to successful farming and has a real impact on the economic health of a farming business. So losing nutrients can be a big deal for farmers. The effect seems to be worse for phosphorus. Erosion can strongly deplete phosphorus stores as it's typically concentrated in the topsoil and is fairly immobile. Soil erosion does affect nitrogen as well. However, mineral nitrogen may be still present in the deeper profiles, which is not affected by soil erosion. And thirdly, heavily eroded soils bring subsoil constraints to the top. So erosion can exacerbate subsoil constraints. What does it cost us? One report from the GRDC states that losing just 1 millimetre of topsoil is the equivalent to losing up to 12 tonne of soil per hectare and can result in a 1 to 6% yield loss. So the drive to protect vulnerable soils is not just about protecting the environment, which of course is a goal, but it's also about mitigating serious impact on the bottom line of farming enterprises. What are the risk factors? Lack of ground cover, wind events and low rainfall. And all of these present in the Mallee. So we can't do much about the wind and we can't do much about the low rainfall, but we can do something about the ground cover. So we're going to focus on ground cover for the rest of my talk. Ground cover is a really good indicator of a healthy functioning ecosystem. It's intrinsically linked to drought resilience as it enables rain filtration, mitigates soil erosion and supports drought recovery. When ground cover is low, the landscape is likely to be more sensitive to future drought events. It can be reduced by overgrazing, and Ali's going to talk a little bit about that at the end of this webinar. Times of drought, we know that large proportion of Victoria agricultural land is prone to drought. Tilling, typically we're in a no-till area here, but we are seeing a small return to tilling practices in the Wimmera and a little bit in the Mallee as well. Poor seed establishment, chemical removal, so summer weed spraying, excessive trafficking, and of course cropping. And cropping is going to be the thing that I focus on for the rest of my talk. So depending on the kind of crop you have, you may be leaving behind low levels of stubble residue. And so there's this tricky trade-off between cropping and protecting soil. For example, if we look at lentils, which are growing in popularity in the region because they're quite a lucrative grain crop, they leave behind almost no stubble residue or very little, certainly not enough to protect the soil. So after harvest, you've got this long period over the summer where the soil is unprotected. So you may be making, a good amount of money out of your lentil crop, but you also may be opening up a risk for your soil as well, which could have a compounding impact in the future. Similarly, cutting cereals. So cereals are good for biomass for ground cover, but cutting them for hay is a good example of how crop end use can have a detrimental impact on ground cover. However, cutting for hay can also be quite an attractive option or strategy depending on how the season is progressing. So there's this trade-off with cropping. At least 50% of cover is recommended to minimise the risk of erosion. However, not all ground covers are equal, as I've been saying. So tall standing stubble is more effective than loose trash for mitigating soil erosion. Furthermore, crops that produce more biomass can help protect soils from erosion. For example, a barley crop versus a legume such as vetch. Barley is typically a better ground cover than vetch, even though vetch produces a lot of biomass typically, and we'll see data supporting this later on. For farming enterprises, though, with a high proportion of land in the high wind erosion risk zones, sowing everything to barley may not be feasible, and it may be quite a risky business decision. So, we all know that typically farms diversify their crop rotations and their choices year to year. So it's important to focus on the crops that are used, such as vetch, and to see what we can do about increasing biomass or protecting soil. This is a wind erosion susceptibility map, courtesy of Catherine Sheffield at the Agriculture Victoria Department. You can see Oyun is in the middle here, and it's in the high wind erosion susceptibility zone. So the focus paddock that I'm going to talk about today is located in Oyun here. So that brings me to the demonstration itself. The paddock is sown on a consistent rotation of cereal and legume. We did the work in the paddock in 2023 while it was in its vetch phase. We did a little bit of work as well in 2024, but in 2022, the paddock was sown to barley. If you recall, a couple of slides back, I directly compared these two crops and said that barley produced better ground cover. And that is what we see. So the images you're looking at here are bare ground index using satellite imagery. The darker the pixel, the more bare ground is detected. So lighter means more ground cover, darker means less ground cover. And you can see the barley is showing lighter pixels there. So we are getting better ground cover at the same time point, relatively same time point. However, so knowing that vetch produces or provides suboptimal ground cover to barley, vetch is still a very important crop in the rotation for many farmers in the region. It's a really versatile crop, and it allows you to change your mind throughout the season. So we don't necessarily want to see vetch leave the rotation, but that means that we need some strategies to try and mitigate soil erosion when we are including vetch in the rotation. And so that's what we set out to do. So in this paddock demonstration, we tried two things. The first relates to the vetch, and we applied a strip of gibberellic acid to see if we could boost vetch biomass production, essentially. So gibberellic acid is already used to promote stem or cell elongation in vetch. It's been used to increase plant height to facilitate cutting for hay, to promote growth and development after grazing, and to delay flowering, or the onset of flowering, which helps delay the cutting window for hay production. The industry data on whether gibberellic acid does increase vetch biomass rather than or also height is inconsistent or inconclusive. So there's still work to be done here, and we thought, given that there's no clear conclusion, we would sow a large strip, take assessments and see what we find. The second thing that we did in this paddock was test the viability of two summer crops. Now, summer ground cover in the Mallee is a tricky topic because of the potential for negative impacts on soil moisture over the summer. Remember that we're in a low rainfall zone. So we assessed the starting soil moisture and soil moisture after termination for both cover crops. And I'll get to that in a few slides. So a bird's eye view of our paddock here, if we look at the gibberellic acid strip, we applied it. It was an early application, and Sentinel-2 imagery, satellite imagery, showed that the gibberellic acid was active on the demonstration strip of vetch. So you get this characteristic lime green effect when you apply gibberellic acid, and that's really clearly shown in the imagery. To assess whether the gibberellic acid had any impact on biomass, we took biomass cuts collected from both strips and for all landforms, so swale, mid-slope and dune, and we kept those separate because obviously growth is going to be really different across the landforms. What the graph shows and all the background data and analysis show is that there was no increase in the biomass for the vetch treated with gibberellic acid. That's a finding that is repeated across other reports as well. It's important to mention at this stage that this is a demonstration, it's not a replicated trial. However, we are also doing some replicated work in this space as well. The only other notable finding was that there was a significant difference between the strips for the mid-slope biomass cuts. So vetch that was sprayed with gibberellic acid was a produced biomass that was significantly lower than untreated vetch. And so it suggests a negative impact on the vetch growing on the mid-slope system. However, remember that this is demonstration data. Now to our summer cover crop patches. So, as I said, we wanted to determine whether a cover crop would succeed in this paddock over a typical summer. We sowed 2 large patches of cover crops. You can see them there in blue. Number 1 was a brassica. We went with white mustard, and we went with that because A, good ground coverage, and B, it's a brassica, so it has a biofumigating effect on the soil. We did detect botrytis quite a bit in the paddock throughout the vetch season, so we thought, let's go with the ground cover, that makes sense. The second patch there is a mix, and you can see the mix listed out on the right-hand side of the screen. That mix is good for quick cover and has a high level of erosion protection and is suitable for grazing and maturing, so particularly applicable to a Mallee farming enterprise. Here are some aerial shots of the patches. They were sown on the 14th of November, and here are some pictures of the patches in February. Now you can see on the left-hand side, we've got our mustard patch where there is no mustard. The mustard did not establish very well at all. In fact, it gave rise to weeds. So we've basically got a weedy patch there, which is a real danger with cover cropping. On the right-hand side is our mix, and it established really nicely, and the weed burden was really low. So you've got a patch that went to weeds, and the risk there is that you are wasting inputs, so you're wasting money by spraying it out, or having to stay on top of those sprays throughout the season due to competition because of seed set in the summer. But as we'll see in a second, the mixed cover crop was not without its consequences as well. Before I get to those results, I'll just cut to some satellite imagery. So this was taken at the end of January. And what we're looking at here is an index that shows the percentage of each pixel where green vegetation is detected. So dark green is correlated with denser green vegetation. So the image basically shows that the mixed species provided more ground cover. If we jump into our results here, as I said, growing ground cover crops in the Mallee can be quite polarising, given concerns around conserving available soil moisture and the economic impact of the opportunity cost. Basically, we'll just ignore the fallow lines there, so we won't worry about the grey. Between the 2 cover patches, we had different starting soil moisture, so they're not directly comparable, but we can look at how much moisture was left over for each patch, and the percentages I've put there are really approximate. Again, remember that this is a demonstration, but essentially it's showing that with your mustard, which didn't establish well and gave rise to weeds, used quite a bit of moisture. But the same happened for the mix as well. So regardless of whether you had weeds or a cover crop, you're still losing precious soil moisture there. So it's important to remember, if cover crops are to be implemented in this region, the choice of ground cover is really important and needs to be considered really carefully. Poor establishment, as we've seen with the mustard, may lead to a higher weed burden and less available soil moisture for the next season, but a mix might do that as well. In a good year, this could be mitigated by good summer rainfall. However, in a low rainfall zone, it could be a risky decision. And BCG is doing plenty of work in this space to see if there are any viable options available for this region and to put some data behind that. So returning to our satellite imagery now, what we're looking at here is the comparison of stubbles. Instead of in season, we're looking at start of 2023 when the paddock was in a barley stubble and the end of 2023 after the vetch has been removed for hay. And remember here that the darker the colour, the more bare ground there is. So the satellite imagery shows that the dunes were particularly vulnerable in this paddock, especially in the vetch stubble. This reinforces that crop choice is really important and it has lasting impacts on your paddock well after harvest. So to recap, the application of gibberellic acid, usually used for as an aid for harvest, it was not effective at increasing vetch crop biomass. And I would say it's not suitable as a tool to increase ground cover for soil protection, with a caveat that this is demonstration. There may be, you may have different conclusions might come out of replicated data or replicated trials. So this is a space that's still being worked in. The mixed summer cover crop established well and provided good ground cover, however, used up precious soil moisture, as did the weedy mustard, sorry about the typo there, leaving less soil moisture for the following crop. So essentially what this tells us is incorporating legume crops in the low rainfall zones without compromising soil cover is very tricky. And the challenge remains how to capitalise on the use of a leguminous crop without compromising soil stability. So I'll leave it there and I'll stop sharing and I'll hand it over to Mark. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Yolanda. It looks like we haven't had any questions come through, so we might keep moving on. If anyone does think of one, please feel free to pop it in the chat box or the Q&A box at the top of the screen. This has been a really interesting project to be a part of, and as Yolanda mentioned, growing ground cover crops in the Mallee can be a polarising topic because obviously there's the concern around soil moisture and the economic impacts that follow, so it can be a risky decision for growers. But this topic feeds really well into our next presentation on cover cropping. So next up, we have Dr. Mark Farrell. Mark is based in South Australia and is a principal research scientist at CSIRO. With over 15 years of experience in a range of agricultural and natural systems, he leads research into carbon and nitrogen cycling in soils and the wider environment. So one of Mark's areas of research includes identifying opportunities to improve soil health and resilience through the targeted adoption of mixed species cover crops in dryland systems. So we're in expert hands to learn more about cover cropping and the effects on productivity, as well as how growers can make better informed decisions. So I'll hand over to you now, Mark. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Demi. I'll make the assumption that everybody can see and hear, and that if you can't, somebody will tell me quickly. Always a bit strange communicating just with the computer screen in a dislocated office for everybody else, but I hope that's good. So yes, thanks for the introduction. My name is Mark Farrell. I'm a research scientist at CSIRO based down in the Wake campus. And as it's coming up to my anniversary in Australia, I've now been here for 14 years, which is rather a surprise to me, but a very good one nonetheless. So today I'll be talking about cover cropping, and I do think this is an excellent follow-on from Yolanda's great talk. And first of all, I'll give just a little bit of a background. If I'd known there was going to be such a great introduction, I wouldn't probably have bothered with these slides. But ultimately, yeah, cover crops are grown in addition or in place of the cash crop. As Yolanda's discussed, there's a lot of interest in mixtures as well as single species. Principally, they are grown with the aim of improving soil health. They may be grazed. I guess if they're completely grazed out, you might question just how much cover they are providing, and that is a fair question. And there has been a lot of interest in cover crops where they've found to be quite successful in parts of Europe and the USA. Here's some data from a large number of on-farm demonstration experiments in the US, showing that years since adoption, things like labile carbon, organic matter, aggregate stability, so soil structure, and respiration as a proxy for microbial activity, whilst there's a lot of variation around them, all tend to trend towards a positive direction the longer the cover crops have been in place. Big question here, of course, where they're planting cover crops in a wet winter fallow usually. We of course grow our crops in the wet winter time. So the question is very much whether or not we can actually be applying some of those findings to attempting to grow cover crops in our dryland cropping systems, which are fundamentally quite different. So some of the considerations, and this is what we worked through at the start of the project, so I'll get into the project itself in a second. Obviously increase NPP, so that's net primary productivity, so that's the amount of carbon fixed by the plant via photosynthesis after accounting for the plant's own metabolism. So that's carbon left over once the plant's done its own respiration for growth. They're a direct source of carbon for microbial activity. You have that cover over the surface, protecting from soil erosion, as Yolanda already touched upon. They do have the opportunity to capture lost nutrients. They improve soil structure and infiltration, and a lot of these things are fairly universal, assuming that they grow and assuming that they don't compromise the rest of the farming system. From a research perspective, who gives presentations, they also give the excuse to show a picture of Jenny Stanton from Kangaroo Island holding a stupidly sized tillage radish. As I worked out fairly quickly, that pretty much any cover crops focused presentation had to have a picture of a tillage radish. They also provide a diversity within the landscape, and that's potentially important when we're thinking about beneficial insects, and certainly some at least observational information we found wandering around these cover crop sites that we had in the project was that they certainly seem to be refuges for beneficial insects that would predate on some pests. But it's not all good. Managed poorly and with the wrong species chosen, there is potential there for green bridge of disease. They can be weedy. The advantage, and this is one thing that Yolanda touched on, I am asked quite often, could we just use weeds as a cover crop? The trouble is, at the highest level, weeds obviously do some of those things. They fix carbon, they provide carbon for microbial activity, they can protect soil from erosion. But you've got very little control over what types of plants are there. They obviously can be very problematic in context of managing for termination. Things like ryegrass are incredibly good at evading herbicides, and so cover crops are typically chosen to be species that can be terminated effectively and that we have some control over. That in itself poses some management issues when it comes to mixed species crops, but nonetheless, the big difference between establishing a cover crop and trying to manage weeds is that you've got a lot more control over the system. Which does take you to the next point. That's not a zero cost aspect. Obviously, you've got the cost of seed, you've got the cost of establishment, you have the cost of management. So it isn't a cost-free exercise and something that does need to be considered in the broader economics of the system. The main one, again, as Yolanda has talked about very clearly, if you're growing something green in summer, it has to use water from somewhere. The data over the next few slides should show that the answer isn't no all the time, but I will be very, very clear it's certainly not yes all the time. So to give an overview of the project itself, this project ran from 2017 to 2021. We're still picking through some of the bones of the data. We had 20 sites across the country. It was initiated by South Australian No-Till Farmers Association, hence the emphasis on South Australia, but you'll see that we had sites in Victoria and also one in Tasmania too. That got us quite a remarkable rainfall gradient from the driest at Waikerie in South Australia, Mallee, down to well over a metre at the Tasmanian side. They were done on commercial farm paddocks. There was other work as part of this project done in more plot scale work, but these were experiments conducted at demonstration scale in commercial farm paddocks. Our treatments were business as usual management, a single species or a multi-species treatment. And at most of these sites, we were doing summer cover cropping. At several of the low rainfall zone sites there, certainly the Mallee sites and one of those on the Western Eyre Peninsula, we did not attempt to grow a summer cover crop and instead displaced a winter cash crop with the cover crop treatment. So they're obviously growing in that cooler, wetter season, a clear opportunity cost if you're growing a cover crop rather than growing a crop that you would hope to harvest. So the project ran for 4 years, but in most cases we only had a couple of years of treatment. We didn't force growers to try to grow cover crops in seasons where it simply wasn't going to be conducive. And we were fortunate in this regard, the only requirement was that in the final year, because we were only able to sample soils once at the end of the project, so in the final year preceding that soil sampling, all sites had to have established a cover crop in that season. As it turned out, of course, the 2020 season was rather wet and rather conducive to cover crops growing. And soils were collected in the final cash ahead of the final cash crop that was established in 2021. So I've got soil data they'll be showing you that is the state of the soil ahead of the yield, ahead of the final cash crop and the yield from that. And we didn't fund this on our own by any stretch, so there was some CSIRO money involved. The whole programme was led by Mark Stanley on the left, with a heck of a lot of assistance from Greg Butler, Sanford on the right. Most of the funding was supplied by the Federal Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, so it would probably now be DAF, through their Smart Farms Land Care Programme. GRDC provided a significant amount of extra funds, which effectively enabled a lot of the soil work to be carried out. So what did we analyse? Obviously cash crop yield and cover crop biomass, soil physics, soil moisture, and we had a go at water holding capacity. That was a fairly high throughput rough and ready measure, but at least it gave us some indication. Soil chemistry, your traditional nutrients, carbon and nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. Total carbon, nitrogen and their fractions, organic nitrogen pools, and there we were particularly interested in precursors to mineral N and whether or not there were changes there. And then also some of the more, well, recently high profile, I would still argue perhaps not the most useful measures of active carbon. And then we did soil biology, so microbial biomass, a particular focus on nitrogen cycling rates. Also looked at carbon use efficiency of the microbes. That's how much the microbes are retaining in the system versus losing as respiration, and then some work on fungal and bacterial communities. This is the slide I find most useful to generalise the findings across the whole project. Right on the left-hand side are the sites listed from Wakery, which is the driest, down to Sisters Creek in Tasmania, which was most definitely the wettest. Across the top are the various different metrics that we looked at. On the right-hand side is a summation of those, and down at the bottom is equally a summation for each of those types of assays and whether or not they were generally improved or generally negatively affected by cover cropping treatment. So what you'll see on that right-hand side is very much an indication that mostly dry to wet. Cover crops mostly had negative impacts in the dry areas and mostly had positive impacts in the wet areas. So just to drill in a little bit more, moisture content, Yolanda's already shown in her demonstration. Obviously, if you're growing something in summer, you typically will affect available soil moisture. Now, in some regions, that might be a gamble worth taking if you're fairly comfortable that you'll normally pick up moisture in autumn ahead of sowing your cash crop. Other areas, it could be quite catastrophic if you had a season, particularly like in South Australia this time, where we had some good rains early on in summer. A landholder might have felt that this was an excellent season to have a go at establishing some cover crops. And then, of course, it pretty much hasn't rained at all until a couple of weeks ago. So there is a major opportunity cost that needs to be managed when it comes to moisture. Interesting thing here, nitrate. So that's the most available form of nitrogen, and in many cases that went down. That isn't, I would argue, a bad story for this data set, because what happened at the same time is that organic nitrogen, microbial biomass nitrogen, and rates of nitrogen turnover all increased. So what's happened here is that pretty much universally across that rainfall gradient, we've seen the cover crop take up nitrogen and retain it in the system. Nitrate, of course, is quite lossy, particularly in wet years, and retain it in forms of nitrogen that are less lossy and would be provided throughout the growing season. And we've seen upregulation in nitrogen turnover, which indicates that nitrogen would be redelivered to the cash crop. Biomass of the cover crop, obviously, funnily enough, mostly increased biomass at the end of the cover crop season. So that business as usual summer fallow was managed as business as usual. So we had some farmers who were very, very hot on weed control, others who weren't. We didn't artificially insist that the control plots were absolutely nuked. We wanted them to be managed relative to what was already being done there. Yield of the cash crop, as you will see, in some cases was affected negatively, and in other cases was affected quite strongly positively. There are trends there towards it being at the wetter end of the spectrum where the benefits are shown, but that one site at Langhorne Creek is an interesting one. Not really mallee per se, but it's deep sandy soil, fairly low rainfall, certainly in the rain shadow of the Mount Lofty ranges. And there we did see an increase. Now that's probably down to the fact that the legumes that were grown there absolutely worked well that year. Water holding capacity, like I said, this assay isn't the most robust, but nonetheless there does appear to be an indication that some of those wetter areas where there's heavier soils actually increasing the amount of water that was held. And in one site on Kangaroo Island, we actually had a statistically significant increase in carbon, or relative increase in carbon relative to control, which was a surprise over such a short time frame. Fungal richness, so that's the amount of fungal species, discrete fungal species there. They were also typically increased, but again, didn't necessarily follow a rainfall gradient. So moving on, and this is quite a busy slide. I've tried to integrate. This is why I tend to prefer the other one that gives a more visual overview rather than trying to show all the data, because trying to show all the data with a project like this gets rather messy. So one thing we looked at was soils down depth profile. So on the left-hand side of all of these figures, that is depth. And then we're looking at a response of the cover crop treatment relative to the control on the x-axis. So further to the right, the greater positive response, further to the left, the greater negative response. I split them into the low rainfall, medium rainfall, and high rainfall zones across our sites. And then we have nitrate at the top, dissolved organic nitrogen, microbial biomass nitrogen, and proteolysis rate, which is the rate of nitrogen turnover. And there were subtle but emerging trends when we looked at these response ratios. Response ratios are an imperfect measurement, but what we had to try and do was take these 20 sites back to being comparable to each other. And that's why we chose to go down this route. Low rainfall zone, interestingly, appeared to be the most responsive. And we certainly saw this at the Wakery site. Nitrate decreased quite significantly, whereas microbial biomass N increased. Single species and multi-species, where there was good establishment, usually had a similar level of effect. So here we're seeing that having a cover crop had a greater impact than what the cover crop was. Organic nitrogen responses were highest in the high rainfall zone. Again, that's another form of nitrogen that will become available rather than is available. Oops, apologies. So overall, it is noisy. This is real data from real farms. They were replicated, but again, these were demonstration trials that we sampled rather than these being a very carefully curated set of experimental plots. They had great use as demonstration trials, and we were quite pleased with that. And we're really quite happy we've been able to fish some data out of these, but nonetheless, it is far from a perfect data set in that regard. So looking at fungal community, and I can see I'm rapidly running out of time. Rainfall gradient really drives that first, but when we dig into the site-specific ones, several sites showed quite big shifts in fungal community. What this is telling us for productivity, as we all know, remains still an imperfectly answered question. But what it is at least showing is that even in these systems where we only had a cover crop once in a while, we were seeing shifts in soil microbial community, and we can infer from that that we may see a shift in soil function. I'm going to very quickly go into the one site where we had the cover had an effect on soil carbon. This was at Stokes Bay. Jenny Stanton was the farmer there. We saw an increase in yield of around about a tonne per hectare. This is in the oats that followed the cover crop, and then multi-species relative to the control. It was a winter cover crop, and there was some grazing done. Summer cover followed by summer cover crops with 240 mils over the summer season. And the mixture there was French white millet, fodder rape, sorghum, and tillage radish. Dry matter inputs increased by 1.3 and 0.9 of a tonne per hectare for the mixed and single species. And there is that statistically significant difference, and it's down at depth where we're seeing a lot more of those roots. We also saw some interesting things going with the microbial community, and I'm going to gloss over this quickly, really showing that where we had the cover crops involved, particularly this multi-species cover crop, the stratification between layers was nowhere near as strong. So that's one thing that cover crops do seem to be able to do, is that they are having an impact on stratification. We saw that in fungi as well, not as pronounced in fungi as bacteria. And we also saw that to some extent in soil chemistry nutrients, but again, not as distinct as this. So there is stuff going on, but in seasons where we're not able to apply this system regularly, which is always going to be the case in a lot of Australian dryland systems, change is likely to be slow and may not be continued. So to conclude, I would say this is most definitely not a definitive data set, but it is an extensive one and probably one of the most consistently collected across a wide range. There's evidence of both yield of increase and decrease, and despite the limited time period, we did see measurable effects, some of which were not always good, some of which were sensitive, such as microfungal community structure, but meaning not necessarily clear, and then some clear positives, microbial biomass N, that's organic carbon measurement at that one site. So notwithstanding seasonality, there is strong evidence for the benefits of cover crops where we're able to keep a living plant cover, but the thing that always has to be understood here is that there is potential opportunity cost, particularly when it comes to moisture. And if a cover crop compromises the cash crop, even if you're minded to think, well, I might take a slight hit on yield because I'm doing better for the soil, don't forget the cash crop itself is also inputting a lot of these ecosystem services into the soil. And if you compromise the cash crop heavily, you might actually be sending the soil backwards as well. So with that, I will thank you for your time and hand back to the guys at Birchip. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. Some really great insights there. Very unsurprising to hear that Waikerie in South Oz was the dry site, as that's actually where my hometown and my family farm is based. So can definitely vouch it's still bloody dry there. But the soil type is very similar to what we'd see in the northern Big Mallee. So it's really interesting to see the relevance. So thank you.
Yeah, and worth noting that was only winter cover cropping there. We did not attempt summer cover cropping.
Yeah, of course. No, thank you very much. We haven't had any questions come through that I can see. So in the interest of time, we'll keep moving on. So next up, we have Alison Frischke presenting. Ali is based in Bendigo and has worked as a project manager in research at BCG since May 2010. She specialises in livestock and farming systems research, working on projects such as dry land legume pasture systems, standing crops to finish lambs, and improving summer ground cover and soil health, as well as oat and hay agronomy. So Ali has a deep interest in ag production, the whole system, and also rural communities. She's our designated livestock and fodder guru here at BCG, so she'll be able to run us through stock requirements and managing grazing for better soil outcomes. So thanks, Ali.
Okay, so good grazing management aims to achieve the best outcomes for our whole system. So it's our pasture availability and how well that's meeting the needs for growth and reproduction of our livestock, as well as pasture persistence and soil health. So I'm going to be talking about what are the requirements for our stock and some of the grazing management strategies that we can use to protect our vulnerable soils. So starting with water and shelter, water, obviously we need cool clean water, 2 to 6 litres per day and more in warm weather, but that trough placement in the paddock can really affect how animals move around to access that water. So ideally, if you can have the trough in the middle of the paddock, you've got the biggest grazing arc around that, but that's not practical. So somewhere halfway along a fence line provides a nice big grazing arc. And if you can situate it off of the fence so that sheep don't camp between the fence and the trough, that'll prevent that camping effect around there. Having a portable water supply, with a truck with a tank or something you can move around the paddock will encourage animals to move to other parts of the paddock, and some shade nearby is good. Again, not having the trough in the shade because they will sit down and camp around that, but if you can separate the trough, they can come in, have their drink and then move over to the shade to rest later when it's warm weather. So really important to have good trough length and flow rate into that, and that holding tank that can supply water, refill the trough quickly, animals come in, get their drink and move away and prevent camping. Shelter in the Mallee, we have gullies and sometimes the sandy rises have been left with vegetation, trees and shrubs to protect those soils. If you're planting them, direction for wind protection is in a north-south sort of direction, whereas for shade it's in the east-west. But you know, having shelter available for animals can affect quite a few production parameters there. When we're grazing pastures or stubbles, we need to be matching our nutrient requirements for different stages of growth. So when we do feed tests, we're looking at digestibility and metabolizable energy, which are related, and they're higher for late pregnant ewes and lactating ewes. Similar for protein as well, and growing lambs need high protein, and nutrient fibre needs to be up as well. So if we have a look at how quality changes in a pasture over a season, going from early in the season when we've just got small shoots, they're high in digestibility, high in energy, and high in protein, but there's not very much of it. As we move later in the season and we move into flowering, that quality drops, and you can see there how the digestibility and energy content goes down, and into a dry stubble later on, or dry grass residue. So doing feed tests is important. And legumes in the system will provide greater digestibility and energy content. So animals eat more legumes. So ideally we want legumes at about 30%, at least 30% of a pasture mix. And if we've got growing lambs out there, they need really high digestibility. And that's just showing low quality. When that falls below around that 55% mark, we're falling below maintenance rates of energy for sheep. And quantity is the other variable as well. Sheep spend 11 to 13 hours a day grazing. And if pasture's too low, so around, below matchbox height, they won't be able to eat enough, and they spend a lot of time walking around trying to find enough feed. But if it's higher, I've got 6 to 8 centimetres there, but really if we aim for up to beer can height, because in a Mallee we'll have spaces in between our pastures. So a taller one, it's less gobfuls to fill up, less energy taken to find that feed. And once they're full, they'll really selectively graze, and you don't get as even pasture utilisation. So anyway, we like that because that means it's rained. In terms of soil management, we know, so soil texture is percentages of sand and silt and clay. For a sandy soil, if we're sowing pastures, we really need to supply fertiliser to that to give good early vigour and top up where nutrients move quickly out of the soil in sandy soils. We need good structure in our sandy rises, and that's influenced by things that will drive plant growth, so things like fertiliser and gypsum, the amount of organic matter in the soil, which influences, and it's been talked about already, but soil nutrients, water holding potential, and infiltration and drainage rates as well. We want to be minimising tillage disturbance in sowing those pastures, and just promoting that plant growth and ground cover, which will structurally protect the soil. The roots will hold the soil and exudates that hold soil particles together as well. So there's a bit of contention around whether grazing affected no-till systems when no-till was being adopted, but we looked at that closely during our grain and graze years, and when you have a look at research across Australia on sandy soils in WA and research around the world, there are no grazing effects in no-till systems, so there were no measurable changes to infiltration, storage of water, no difference in crop and pasture establishment or yield following grazing. Soil structure, sometimes there's a visual change, but it's not a long-term impact, and that includes pugging even on heavy soils. And usually most compaction can be alleviated by that next tillage pass. And the soil nutrition and carbon, no negative effects, but the huge proviso is that we're not overgrazing, and we're keeping good ground cover there to protect the soil. So the more carbon back into the system, the better, more resilient that's going to be against effects of grazing. When we talk about ground cover, we're looking for Many benchmarks are around 70%. For the Mallee, we talk more about 50% of anchored material, mainly because sometimes it's hard to get more than that. It's just simply a function of rainfall. So somewhere between that 50 and 70% anyway, providing that soil protection. When we're grazing the large paddocks in the Mallee, and we'll have a look at some grazing maps in a minute, but when we have less sheep and large paddocks, we can get overgrazing in some areas and undergrazing of other areas. So priority needs to be given for the ground cover on those lighter soil areas when we're determining whether to keep stock going or take them off of there in terms of ground cover. This is a chart that Gupta shared with us when we had a Future Drought Fund project recently in collaboration with the South Australian Mallee. But it's collectively looking at, we took 35 soil samples across the Vic Mallee and South Australian Mallee and looked at practices behind it and came up with a matrix like Mark showed before, and then a bit of an indice combining all the effects that all the different practices had on certain things measured in the soil. But this table summarising what the different practices there on the left. So looking at stubble retention. Stubble is a critical source of carbon for microbes, microbial biomass and processes, and changing it causes changes in composition of the community. And grazing, removal of carbon inputs can negatively affect biomass and biological processes. But we're not really clear about what effects on the microbial composition are. And again, ground cover there and crop diversity, so that fits in with the cover crops just talked about. Again, pointing to it's a big source of carbon for all these things and creates changes to the community. And I guess we're still understanding about what exactly those parts of the community are and how they affect plant growth. But in grazing management, the more carbon we can keep in the system, the better off our soil health will be. So it just needs, it's not saying to take sheep out of the system, but it's just maintaining as much microbial ground cover as we can. Quickly, just on grazing strategy. So there's a few different grazing strategies just in that picture there. We've got a large area and sheep or stock go on there and are just kept there for a long period of time. They just stay there all year, maybe are taken off if the paddock needs to be sprayed or used for something else. But large paddock, less stock, leads to areas of the paddock not being grazed as well, or preferential grazing of certain species, so it can change the composition of the pasture out there. If we have a look at a more rotational grazing setup, you have a smaller paddock with more stock, or just moved more often, so that you can try and apply some pressure onto the grazing as less selection and move the animals out, and you can have recovery of those plants for another grazing later on. And a couple of other types. Cell grazing is really intensive, more something for the dairy industry. Again, lots of stock and on a small area. Quick, get them out and move them on to the next one and let that paddock recover. So the grazing strategy will influence how the paddock's utilised, but regardless, a good system is going to effectively look at that carrying capacity and the time of spilling for the recovery of whatever you're grazing during our winter period in that case. Reduce uneven grazing that's wasteful, harmful. Use it to match the stocking rate to the quality of the pasture out there needed for different classes of animals, and we can use it for either hazard reduction, like in terms of fire, or pest and weed control, which we've certainly seen over the past 12 months with increasing slugs and snails. The stocking rate's the other thing we manage. It kind of goes hand in hand with that pasture utilisation, but again, we're trying to meet those target requirements for stock, get them out before the pasture reaches critical limits, and we've got that period before the next grazing coming along. So By doing feed budgets, we can estimate how long a paddock will last with a particular number of livestock, or we can try and estimate how much can I put in there while retaining a residual pasture cover for a set period of time. A project that we ran a few years ago, funded by the Mallee CMA in collaboration with Mallee Sustainable Farming and University of New England, had a look at a paddock at Nandaly with sandy rises and flats in it. You can see the EM38 map on the left there. It was a 107 hectare paddock, so a large paddock. Put 202-year-old ewes on there, and 25 of those ewes had collars on them. That GPS tracked them every 7 minutes over a period of weeks, grazing a barley stubble over summer and a vetch crop in winter time. And from the GPS, they could tell whether they're moving around or camping or grazing. From that activity of the sheep, they were able to make these maps. So each map is created 10 days apart. So this is the maps for the summer grazing of the barley stubble. And if you can see my cursor, this is a lighter part of the paddock at the northern end of the paddock, and the southern end of the paddock is also up on a bit of a rise, and this is where the trough was. And you can see that they were really sticking to those lighter areas at the start, but as time went on, they moved out across the rest of the paddock and grazed the paddock reasonably easy. We were taking ground cover and biomass and counting the number of grains per quadrat in there as well, so we had some idea of the feed that they were eating. So ground cover over at that period of time between mid-January to late February, on average didn't fall below the 50% sort of benchmark that we aim for, but there were areas of the paddock that were probably on that already when stock went in. So if we could keep stock off those areas, it'd be quite favourable. And in winter, so up here was a bit of a gully. You can see in the picture of the sheep on the right there, they tended to camp down in the gully, and they didn't really move off of that 10 days or even 20 days. They're just starting to branch out, and they had a bit more coverage, but they really didn't use 25% of the paddock during that grazing time. And we can see from we had 29 sampling points around the paddock, and here's one from the western side of the paddock where they were camping. They were really just keeping up with the growth of the vetch, and it didn't really get away. Whereas on the eastern side, where they weren't utilising it, it was growing away from them and they weren't using it. So if you have a look at that winter vetch part, stocking rate was 5.6 DSC per hectare, but really because they weren't using all the paddock, it was 7.3 on 75% of the paddock. By using improved grazing management, like using the portable electric fencing, and Michael's here on one of our earlier grainer graze field days with the rapid fencing. I think that one was the wrapper, and there's a Kiwi Tech 2 that you can put on the bike and easily run out. You could actually utilise more pasture and run an extra 65 ewes and lambs, or alternatively, if we cut hay, we could have made more profit, and that's just the numbers at the time. So in terms of management for those 2 periods of the year, in summertime, if we could have had movable water points or the ability to keep them off the lighter areas, it would have been good for those ground cover targets and lighter soils. And in winter time, again, if we can sort of bunch sheep together or increase mob size, we could have had better utilisation of that pasture. So, but it really demonstrated how virtual fencing could have been used in both situations, and SARDI are doing some ongoing research with sheep on that at the moment. So just on growing fodder, yeah, you know these things. We can use fodder banks and forage shrubs, and the Enrich project highlights some of those more useful ones. It's recommended to avoid heavy grazing of fenced off areas, although we do like to use scrub areas, but I guess if they've got vulnerable vegetation in there or grass species, if we're grazing them in a really dry time, it's harder for that vegetation to recover after that. So otherwise, grazing, we've got grazing crops both in winter or in spring into summer, and various legume mixes that I'll talk about. And we have that option of putting sheep into containment, either when our feed values decline to a certain point where it's not meeting energy needs and we're doing so much supplementary feeding in the paddock, or we've fallen below our ground cover targets. So pretty useful thing to be able to, and particularly this year with a late break, to use containment to remove stock, particularly using late pregnancy, and off the paddocks and let pastures establish. So grazing cereals in winter, really quick recap, it's cereals jump out of the ground, cover the ground quickly, and is highly nutritious feed. If we want to get biomass back later on, we need to graze early and get them off early before the end of tillering. Usually it will compromise dry matter regrowth and grain yield if we're doing that. So leave some green leaf there and it's got a better chance of coming back. And one of the projects we looked at was using a standing crop, so still a sown crop, treated exactly the same, but graze later in the year. So in this case, more like, or we might be grazing a cereal crop in June or July with a good start. Later in the year, talking more like July, August. In this, we're looking for a mix though of cereal and with an undersown legume pasture of some sort to deliver protein. And it just provides a larger fodder bank and more ground cover later in the year that we can put stock onto to finish. In drought, if we have a failed crop, our crops are shorter, but they're also more digestible. They've got higher energy and more protein because it's concentrated into a shorter amount of biomass. And it's recommended to avoid grazing stock on them, but it's, I think, really, because those residues are going to break down faster with high nutrition and they're going to be grazed off faster as well. But if you've got grain out there, it's certainly a useful resource. For the cereals that we grow as a standing crop, usually something that's well adapted, something that's in the silo, will give us pretty flexible options. Otherwise, we can have fit for purpose varieties, so winter grazing. We've got Moby, now crack and barley style crop. If we're going into that later grazing just for forage, we've got longer season outback oats style cereals. Finishing land, we want grain varieties with good protein, so we want barley over oats in that situation. Or there are cereals available which have herbicide tolerance now for grass control. And highlighting here, just on the nutrition front, so this was just a little demo we did a few years ago with 5 varieties. But if you take a look at protein, early in the piece we've got high protein. By anthesis, it's down to the quality of hay, which is really only maintenance level. And then once grain is set in that crop, we've got good grain protein again. And that occurs for all varieties. And metabolisable energy, the same thing's happening. So that's why we need to have that legume component in there or be supplying a legume grain around that time of anthesis. Flowering, it's less palatable and it needs a top up of protein to keep production going. The previous project where we had a look at legume pasture systems, if we're having a look at a hard-seeded medic option for the lighter sands, the disc and Australian medics are more suitable. When it came to the alternative legume types that have come out on a neutral sand, so here at speed, the Serradella did quite well, and we've seen it at Lawlight, we saw it at Watchupka here as well. So Serradella is good when the sand is neutral, but if you've got alkaline sand, those are the harder seeded medics. But in a lot of situations with a high cropping intensity, we will use more the vetch and soft seeded legumes. And just finishing, taking a look at the role of mixed pasture or multi-species for grazing. So it's going to provide quick ground cover Like Mark said, bring that diversity of biology in the roots and the forage, which is for forage, that can be good for animal health, because it's providing feed at different times and ground cover at different times of the year. And you see in the picture on the right, the sheep are going to preferentially graze different species. And one of the paddocks we looked at, they were picking all the cereals out and then later going for the brassicas and then later on for the vetch. And another paddock we've been involved in where they were able to sow plantain and clover early. They were taking that out with the cereal and the lucerne was last. So just an example of how they might preferentially graze across the season. Using adapted species and varieties is going to be your better chance of growing more biomass, of course, and like everything, managing our grazing to protect our ground cover and the feed quality is most important. And I guess the key is not waiting until it looks pretty. So there were some flowers in the picture before from the summer one, but from a feed perspective, that's getting too late around that anthesis time. We want to graze it early with lots of nutrition. So yeah, grazing management takes in a whole heap of things, from our stock requirements to how we manage those different components of grazing in the paddock. Thank you, I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks, Ali. It's past 1 o'clock now, so that concludes the webinar. Thanks to everyone for tuning in today, and thank you to the presenters, Ali, Mark and Yolanda, for sharing their knowledge and expertise. If anyone does want to continue the conversation further or has any burning questions, please reach out to me and I can put you in touch with the presenters. At BCG, we do run many events and activities, so it's always helpful to gain feedback on the content we deliver and the ways in which we deliver it. So I will be sending out a post-webinar survey shortly. It's very brief, only 5 simple questions, but I'd really appreciate it if you could please fill it out, as it does help with the way we continue our work. So anyway, thanks everyone for attending. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, their weekend, and that the rain keeps coming for our growers. Thanks everyone, bye.